Yo, what's up, everyone? It's your boy Disaster. Welcome to a place where there's no turning back. This is a marathon designed to put you under. Whether it's scorching summer or a rainy spring outside, forget about it. In here, the rain never stops, and the year is nothing but a bone-chilling, frozen winter. The sky out there, it's never gonna clear up. Here's the deal, and I need you to follow my lead. Get to your room, kill the lights, and throw on your headphones. Lay back, get comfortable, and hit that auto replay setting. Close both eyes, and listen till the very end. I'm telling you, the dread levels are gonna spike with every passing minute. And look, before we dive into the abyss, if you feel like this hour of horror is worth it, smash that like button. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it means the world to me. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into crafting this hour-long nightmare just for you. Brace yourself, boss, it's time for some ice-cold horror. Enjoy the ride. The razor-wire fencing perimeter of Camp 41 hums under the brutal, whipping bite of the alpine mountain wind, a metallic, screeching hiss that cuts straight through the dead, suffocating darkness of the night. Hiss, low rattle, hum. There is no warmth left in this altitude, no mercy in the freezing, bone-chilling fog of the winter of 1943. This cold doesn't just bite at your flesh or sting your cheeks, it bores straight through your marrow, freezing the very thoughts inside your skull before they have a chance to form, turning breath into hard, frozen crystals before it even leaves your lips. I stand rigid at the highest, most isolated point of the weathered wooden guard tower, wearing a heavy, grease-stained military overcoat that offers zero defense against the frost, my wool-gloved fingers clamped tight around the steel stock of my service rifle. The metal is so completely frozen it feels less like a weapon and more like a permanent, icy extension of the glacier beneath us. Inside my inner coat pocket, pressed flat against my chest, the heavy brass casing of my pocket watch ticks away with a slow, agonizing, relentless weight. Tick, tick, tick. Every single revolution of that tiny gear feels like a nail being driven deeper into the coffin of the night, reminding me of how long I have left in this purgatory. I peer out across the thick, swallowing gray blanket of fog stretching endlessly over the barbed wire trenches, the desolate muddy paths, and the sprawling, silent barracks of the camp below. No movement. No patrolling boots on the frostbitten gravel. No living soul in sight. To anyone else looking down from this jagged cliffside, this is nothing more than a routine, boring, agonizingly quiet graveyard shift in the middle of nowhere, guarding empty supply crates and sleeping soldiers. But I know the absolute truth. I can feel it humming in the static of the air, pressing against my temples. The midnight watch in this forgotten watchtower isn't about scanning the perimeter for escaping prisoners, deserters, or enemy infantry. It's a silent, suffocating vigil against the dead. The hundreds of souls who were violently ripped from their bodies out here in the snow, whose screams were swallowed by the blizzards, and whose restless energy now lingers in the freezing shadows between the barracks, waiting for someone alive to finally stop ignoring them and listen to their endless, silent whispers. Every board beneath my boots groans with the weight of unseen presences, daring me to look closer into the dark abyss. They transferred me to Camp 41 3 weeks ago, dumping me in this godforsaken, isolated corner of the earth like a piece of discarded military cargo, far away from any real front line, yet somehow much closer to something infinitely worse, darker, and more permanent. Long before the modern high command seized the property, retrofitted the perimeter with razor wire, and turned it into a rearguard staging ground, an ammunition depot, and a temporary holding facility for exhausted, broken battalions, the entire compound was an ancient, sprawling medieval monastery. A sacred, isolated place carved directly into the unforgiving stone of the mountain where monks once took strict, lifelong vows of absolute, unbreaking silence, burying their voices, their grief, and their private prayers deep within these thick limestone walls long before the first bullet was ever forged or fired in anger by human hands. From my very first day walking through those heavy iron gates, I could feel deep down in my gut that something was fundamentally and profoundly wrong with the texture of the air itself. It didn't smell like a standard wartime military outpost. There was no sharp, lingering stench of stale gunpowder, burnt diesel, cheap tobacco, or unwashed bodies crammed into tight, rotting spaces. Instead, the atmosphere was saturated with a thick, unnatural stillness, an oppressive, heavy quiet that mirrored the hollow, suffocating silence found inside abandoned crypts or ancient cathedrals long after the last candle has been blown out and the congregation has vanished forever into the dark. Down in the long, drafty wooden barracks, the soldiers never talked about the front lines, the horror of the battles, or the families they left behind in the ruins of Europe. They didn't laugh, they didn't gamble, and they didn't even fight among themselves. They just collapsed onto their rusted iron cots in absolute, bone-deep exhaustion, sleeping with pale, sunken faces, looking less like living, breathing men and more like hollowed-out, animated corpses waiting for the end. Every single morning, they woke up looking even more drained, dragging their feet across the frozen floorboards, as if their vital life force, their very souls, were being slowly and methodically siphoned right out of their bodies drop by drop every single time the sun went down and the midnight darkness took absolute control of the camp. The heavy wooden doors of the barracks seemed to trap a collective, suffocating despair that clung to the damp walls like a layer of invisible frost, resisting even the harsh chemical disinfectants and the biting alpine drafts that swept through the unsealed window frames. No man ever spoke above a harsh, fractured whisper after the sun dipped below the jagged mountain ridge, as if everyone instinctively understood that raising your voice in this cursed sanctuary was an open invitation to whatever ancient, watchful presence lived just beneath the stones. I often lay awake on my narrow cot for hours, staring up at the dark, splintered beams of the ceiling, listening to the synchronized, shallow breathing of dozens of broken men who looked as though they were trapped in the middle of a continuous, waking nightmare from which there was no possible escape. The very structure of the camp felt less like a protective military installation and more like a massive, open-air cage designed to hold something back from the rest of the world, keeping a forgotten terror locked safely away behind barbed wire and stone while slowly feeding it the spiritual essence of everyone foolish enough to be stationed within its borders. When the duty roster finally came down the line assigning me to solitary night watch duty in the isolated wooden tower from 1 in the morning until the first break of dawn, one of the older, battle-hardened veterans, a man whose eyes had already gone entirely dead behind a thick, impenetrable wall of trauma, pulled me aside in the dim, flickering light of the mess hall. His voice was barely a dry, raspy rattle, his trembling fingers gripping my forearm with terrifying urgency as he whispered into the freezing air, "Never light a single match, a candle, or a lantern up in that tower. The light anchors your physical body to the wood and the stone, but the absolute, pitch-black dark is the only thing standing between you and the complete shattering of your soul." The luminous hands of my pocket watch finally snap into harsh, definitive alignment, marking exactly 2 o'clock after midnight in the dead center of absolute nowhere. The deep, crushing, impenetrable silence of the towering mountain presses down against the frail wooden walls of the guard tower with the terrifying, suffocating weight of an entire ocean trench bearing down on a fragile hull. Outside, the thick, damp, freezing alpine fog curls, twists, and writhes around the base of the weathered, creaking timber stilts like a pale, shifting sea of ghostly cotton clouds, swallowing the landscape, the trenches, and the barbed wire entirely from human sight. I close my tired, burning eyes for just a brief, burning second, trying desperately to relieve the intense, throbbing strain of staring for hours too long into the absolute, pitch-black nothingness of the empty darkness. The biting chill of the midnight air creeps slowly through the thin, splintered cracks of the window frame, sliding icy, invisible fingers across the back of my neck and sending violent, involuntary shudders racing down the entire length of my spine. I stand rigidly at my post, gripping the worn, freezing wood of my rifle stock until my knuckles ache from the sheer, unyielding pressure, refusing to let my breathing give away the sudden panic tightening like a steel wire around my throat. The faint, sickly glow of the single kerosene lantern hanging from the center rafter flickers wildly, casting long, distorted, dancing shadows that stretch and twist across the barren floorboards as if desperately trying to break free from the room and escape into the dark. Every nerve ending in my body is pulled taut, strained to its absolute breaking point, reacting to the phantom creaks and settling groans of the old timber tower as it fights against the brutal, howling alpine wind tearing down from the jagged peaks above. I stare fixedly into the swirling, impenetrable gray fog outside the glass, waiting, dreading whatever horrific shape might suddenly materialize out of the shifting mist to test the fragile limits of my sanity. And that exact, freezing second is when the whispering begins to crawl out of the earth. It isn't a sound that travels through the physical air to strike the drum of the ear. There are no external acoustic waves bouncing off the rotting wood to be heard with ordinary flesh and bone. Instead, it manifests as a series of subtle, deeply rhythmic vibrations pulsing directly inside the hollow cavity of my chest, vibrating violently against my ribs and echoing deep within the hidden corridors of my mind. A collective, endless whisper, soft, rhythmic, hauntingly steady, and utterly inescapable, rising straight up from the frozen earth, the packed mud, and the decaying soil directly beneath the tower where generations of forgotten prisoners, nameless deserters, executed men, and broken soldiers were dumped into mass, unmarked graves during the bitter, unforgiving winter months of the past. The voices do not scream, nor do they howl with the fiery, violent malice of bitter vengeance. They carry no anger, no blazing hatred, and no wild, frantic desperation. Instead, they flow upward like a ghostly, sorrowful mist, laden with a profound, transparent, crushing sorrow, reciting ancient prayers, fragments of forgotten hymns, and long-lost words in a dozen different dead languages. They are calling out into the freezing void, not to threaten the living or spill blood, but to seek a moment of desperate grace, begging the universe for a single touch of peace, a tiny fragment of closure, and the sweet, unattainable release of eternal rest that was stolen from them by the horrors of war. The whispers beneath the floorboards continue their relentless, rhythmic pulse, rising and falling like the slow, agonizing breath of a buried giant, a constant, haunting reminder that we are merely trespassers standing precariously on top of a massive, forgotten graveyard. And as the heavy, suffocating seconds crawl by into eternity, the realization settles deep into my chest with bone-chilling certainty. The dead down there are not resting, and sooner or later, they are going to demand that someone down in the trenches finally answer their eternal, agonizing call. I stand completely frozen in the dark, my knuckles locked white around a freezing rifle stock, listening to the dead speak their quiet, broken hearts out into the freezing night, realizing that the true terror of this mountain isn't the enemy outside the gates, but the forgotten souls trapped right beneath our boots. I reached instinctively with my trembling, gloved fingers for the heavy, brass-bound military binoculars hanging tightly against my chest, lifting the freezing, ice-coated optics to my eyes to pierce the thick veil of darkness. I adjusted the focus wheel, sweeping the lenses slowly across the long, desolate, snow-choked stretch of no-man's land bridging the twisted razor-wire perimeter and the heavy iron main gates of Camp 41. Through the coated glass lenses, under the dim, sickly, bruised wash of the moonlight fighting through the turbulent layers of fog, I saw them. No advancing infantry platoons marching in formation. No armed scouts creeping through the ditches. No enemy infiltrators or desperate deserters trying to slip past the wire. Instead, The entire open field was crowded with silent, drifting specters of pale, shifting gray light, gathering together in vast, orderly, and agonizingly quiet circles directly above the snow-drifted earth. These were spiritual forms vaguely echoing the upright shapes of human beings, yet completely stripped of all physical weight, material density, and worldly features. They stood with an overwhelming, crushing sense of ancient dignity and profound, bottomless sorrow, slowly raising their transparent, skeletal hands toward the pitch-black sky as if engaged in an eternal, silent supplication to a higher power that had long since forgotten them. The most terrifying, spine-chilling detail of all was the state of the snow beneath them. Their weightless, floating feet did not leave a single indentation, a single footprint, or a single disturbance in the pristine, fragile white blanket of winter. The fierce, biting alpine wind blew straight through their spectral bodies as if they were nothing more than thin, wispy smoke, never once shifting the tails of their ethereal coats or disturbing the air around them. As I held the binoculars pressed desperately against my throbbing eye sockets, the pale, luminous figures began to shift collectively in unison, turning their blank, featureless visages directly toward the wooden guard tower as though they could feel the heavy gaze of a living observer watching them from the shadows. The invisible pressure radiating from their massed presence grew exponentially, pressing against the glass of the window and the timber of the walls with a quiet, psychic intensity that made my temples pound with a sharp, blinding migraine. I could feel the microscopic hairs on the back of my neck standing rigidly on end, responding to a sudden, violent shift in the static charge of the air that smelled faintly of old iron, ozone, and frozen dust. Every instinct screaming inside my evolutionary wiring demanded that I drop the binoculars, dive flat onto the floorboards, and curl into a fetal ball of self-preservation, yet my body remained locked in a state of absolute, petrified paralysis, utterly transfixed by the heartbreaking majesty of the forgotten dead. The silence outside deepened into something absolute and profound, swallowing even the whistling shriek of the alpine wind, until the only sound left in the entire universe was the erratic, frantic pounding of my own heart hammering desperately against my ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. A deep, shivering wave of pure spiritual awe crashed violently over my nervous system, not a gut-wrenching terror of physical violence, gunfire, or murder, but an overwhelming, paralyzed reverence born from standing entirely unprotected in the immediate, raw presence of a world that exists forever behind the final, ironclad veil of death. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a fleeting second, I forgot how to breathe, caught completely between the living world of iron and blood and the silent eternity unfolding before my eyes. As the midnight hour peaked and began its slow, inevitable slide toward the deeper abyss of the early morning, the world around me shifted with terrifying suddenness. The flickering, dying oil lantern hanging from a rusted iron hook in the center of the wooden ceiling of the watchtower didn't just fade, it snapped entirely out, plunged into absolute, pitch-black nothingness as if choked by an invisible hand. Instantly, the cabin was swallowed by a heavy, suffocating dark that felt less like the absence of light and more like a physical wall closing in from all sides, pressing against my temples with a quiet, malicious intent. At that exact second, every remaining trace of warmth was violently sucked out of my physical body. The brutal, biting cold of the mountain winter vanished, replaced by an unnatural, dead void that froze my blood deeper than any frost ever could, turning my veins into rigid channels of ice. I couldn't feel the solid wood of the floor beneath my heavy boots anymore. I couldn't feel the weight of the steel service rifle clutched in my trembling hands, nor could I feel the stinging bite of the freezing wind against my face. My physical form felt hollow, disconnected, like an abandoned husk left behind in the rushing current of time, floating adrift in an ocean of pure nothingness. It felt as though my ribcage had been wrenched wide open, exposing the core of my being, and my soul was suddenly unmoored, hanging suspended in the empty air between the rotting timbers of the tower and the starless, infinite void of the night sky. In that breathless moment of total suspension, the ambient sound of the howling wind died away, replaced by an absolute, ringing vacuum that echoed endlessly inside the chambers of my mind. The silent figure standing at the edge of the watchtower floor did not move or speak, yet his very presence filled the freezing space with a crushing, unbearable gravity that felt heavier than tons of falling stone. I tried to command my locked jaw to move, desperately attempting to form a single coherent word or a breathless warning, but my vocal cords were completely paralyzed, trapped inside a throat that felt choked with fine, dry dust. The pale, luminous glow emanating from his spectral frame cast long, shifting shadows across the rotting timber walls, revealing faint, ghostly details of a tattered, ancient uniform that had long since rotted away to dust in the mass graves below. His eyes, hollow, deep-set, and shimmering with an infinite, heartbreaking sorrow, seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 forgotten wars, reflecting every drop of blood, every unheeded prayer, and every agonizing, lonely death suffered on this cursed mountain across centuries of human conflict. And then, I heard it, the faintest, most impossible sound imaginable. Footsteps. Light, deliberate, and utterly weightless. Someone, or something, was ascending the steep wooden ladder leading up to the watchtower. Yet, the old, warped steps didn't creak, groan, or snap under pressure. They remained entirely silent, as if weight was nothing more than an illusion of the living world. A shadow, or rather, a dense condensation of moonlight caught in a shroud of mist, materialized at the top of the stairwell, stepping effortlessly into the enclosed cabin just 2 paces away from where I stood frozen. It took the shape of an old man, or perhaps a soldier from a forgotten century, his form radiating a faint, sickly luminescent glow that resembled the pale light of a moon choked by thick storm clouds. He stood there in the absolute dark, looking straight through my eyes and deep into the fragments of my fractured soul. Without a sound, he raised a semi-transparent hand toward me, pointing a long, skeletal finger not in threat or malice, but with a gesture of profound, aching urgency, as if attempting to hand down a crushing burden of truth that could no longer be kept locked beneath the earth. The temperature in the small cabin plunged even further into an absolute, unnatural zero, freezing the moisture in my eyelashes and locking my limbs in a state of eternal, rigid stone. I could feel the invisible boundaries of my own consciousness beginning to stretch and thin out, dissolving slowly into the vast, swirling ocean of memories and echoes that filled the room, realizing with sudden, horrifying clarity that the border between the living guard and the forgotten dead had completely vanished, leaving me standing alone at the ultimate edge of eternity where no human being was ever meant to go. The spectral figure standing just 2 paces away from me in the absolute dark did not utter a single word, nor did I attempt to open my mouth or break the suffocating stillness with the clumsy tools of human speech. There was no need for sound, no requirement for breath or syntax. Communication in this elevated, freezing realm bypassed the physical senses entirely, flowing directly across the silent gulf between us as a series of heavy, freezing mental impressions that settled into my consciousness like descending frost. From the very first instant our awareness locked, I knew with absolute certainty that this entity was not a harbinger of malice, destruction, or evil. It was a guardian, an ancient, lingering presence bound to these stony peaks long before the modern era carved military roads into the mountainside, long before the first barbed wire was unspooled or the first battalion of soldiers marched up the winding trails. The cold surrounding us began to shift, losing its sharp, biting sting and transforming into an oppressive, heavy stillness that felt as dense and unyielding as solid rock. I could feel the microscopic fibers of my woolen uniform freezing stiff against my skin, yet strangely, the terror that had previously locked my heart in a vice grip began to slowly dissolve, replaced by an eerie, unnatural tranquility. It was the same profound quiet that settles over a deep forest immediately after a heavy snowfall, where every harsh sound is swallowed up by an immense, blank canvas of white. The old sentry's glowing silhouette flickered softly, casting long, wavering rays of pale light that seemed to bend around the wooden beams of the room as if acknowledging an unseen, absolute authority governing this hidden altitude. Every breath I drew tasted faintly of ozone and ancient dust, a stark reminder that I was breathing air that had remained untouched by the living world for centuries. Without moving its lips or shifting its ethereal posture, the entity opened a window into the deep, forgotten memory of the landscape, projecting vivid, sweeping visions straight into my mind. I saw the mountain as it had existed centuries ago, long before the horrors of modern war poisoned the soil, a place of profound, undisturbed isolation, where stone huts and early monastic sanctuaries offered a haven of absolute quiet. I saw souls who had lived, prayed, and eventually passed away here in total peace, dedicating their existence to seeking light and divine harmony far away from the chaotic noise of human civilization. The sweeping panorama of images expanded rapidly inside my mind's eye, unfolding like an ancient, hand-drawn scroll depicting ages long forgotten by history books and school curricula. I watched generations of devoted anchorites walking these exact rocky slopes in heavy woolen robes, their heads bowed in prayer, carrying crude wooden lanterns through blinding snowstorms just to find shelter in small stone alcoves carved directly into the cliff face. Their lives were entirely defined by rigorous discipline, fasting, and an unwavering commitment to inner silence, believing with every fiber of their being that the truest communion with the divine could only be achieved by cutting all ties with the turbulent, noisy clamor of mortal society below. They cultivated an environment of total peace, turning the mountain into a sacred sanctuary where the air itself felt purified by generations of unvoiced meditations and spiritual devotion. But then the visions shifted, fracturing like thin ice under a heavy boot as the dark shadow of human conflict crept slowly up the valleys. The stone huts were replaced by wooden barracks, the quiet prayer spaces were choked with barbed wire and artillery crates, and the pure, pristine snow was stained dark with the mud, oil, and blood of young men sent to die for flags they barely understood. Yet, even through the endless layers of carnage and suffering, the foundational spirit of the mountain refused to die. Instead, it absorbed the chaos, quietly folding every broken soldier, every terrified deserter, and every forgotten corpse into its ancient, eternal embrace, transforming a modern theater of war into a massive, silent cemetery where all men finally became equal in death. As the visions washed over me, a silent, profound understanding bloomed within my thoughts, carrying the weight of an eternal truth. The voice of the ancient guardian echoed through my mind like a quiet bell tolling in the distance. The violence, the gunfire, and the bloodshed down below in the camp are merely the desperate, temporary illusions of the physical body, young soldier. They belong to the fleeting world of mud, iron, and temporary breath. But here, in the quiet embrace of the mountain, every lost soul eventually returns to a single, undivided origin, stripped of all military titles, ranks, uniforms, and weapons, resting forever in the pure silence of the cosmos. The ancient guardian slowly shifted his glowing, translucent gaze away from my eyes, turning his pale, shifting head toward the edge of the wooden guard tower platform to look down into the sprawling, snow-choked valley below. Raising a hand composed entirely of pale, luminescent mist, he pointed a long, skeletal finger toward the desolate expanse where the shadows of the camp stretched out beneath the bruised moonlight. Following his silent gesture, I looked down through the open air, and what I saw unfolded before my eyes like a scene from another realm of existence. The hundreds of drifting, luminous specters that had previously wandered aimlessly across the snow-choked no-man's land had completely transformed their formation. They were now assembling in vast, perfectly aligned, and breathtakingly orderly rows, forming silent circles around the perimeter of the ancient, stone-built foundation at the heart of the camp, the very structure that had served as the core of the medieval monastery centuries before the military repurposed it into a holding compound and barracks. There was no sound, no spoken command, and no chaotic scuffling of boots. Yet, every single spectral form moved with an absolute, synchronized grace, sinking slowly to their knees upon the frozen, unyielding earth in an act of deep, collective supplication and prayer. As they settled into their devotional positions, a faint, pulsing phosphorescent light began to emanate from their ethereal chests, casting a soft, shimmering turquoise glow across the pristine white snow fields. Remarkably, the light possessed no physical heat. It illuminated the landscape with a brilliant, soothing clarity without melting a single snowflake or disturbing the fragile crust of winter ice. As I watched the silent assembly from my elevated vantage point in the wooden tower, a sudden, overwhelming wave of profound peace crashed over my nervous system, a total, absolute serenity unlike anything I had ever experienced through all the long, brutal years of my life and the endless, nerve-wracking months of the war. All of the jagged, gnawing fear of sudden death, all of the suffocating anxiety regarding tomorrow morning's artillery barrage, and all of the heavy, bitter resentment toward the commanders who had sent me to this forgotten wasteland simply melted away, dissolving into nothingness as if they had never existed at all. The internal storm that had raged inside my chest for as long as I could remember was suddenly silenced, replaced by an infinite, boundless calm that stretched out as far as the eye could see. Without thinking, without hesitation, and driven by a pure, irresistible spiritual compulsion, my knees buckled beneath me. I dropped heavily onto the rough, frost-covered wooden planks of the guard tower floor, letting my service rifle slide unheeded from my gloved fingers to clatter softly against the timber. I bowed my head, surrendering completely to the silent, sacred communion unfolding below, joining the dead in their eternal, peaceful vigil of pure, unblemished light. For a brief, suspended span of time that seemed to stretch far beyond the normal boundaries of earthly clocks and ticking gears, the physical architecture of Camp 41 entirely faded from my perception, dissolving into a shimmering, transparent memory. The oppressive barbed wire fences, the rusted iron gates, the jagged silhouettes of the surrounding guard towers, and the long, dark rows of the military barracks vanished from my sight, replaced by a vast, timeless, open valley untouched by the scars of modern war. In this boundless, ethereal expanse, the landscape was bathed in a gentle, amber twilight that filtered down through the ancient, towering branches of primeval pine trees whose roots ran deep into the heart of the mountain. And there, walking quietly among the glowing ferns and the soft moss, I saw them, the physical, living men who slept so restlessly in the cold iron cots down in the camp below. Their bodies lay fast asleep back in the barracks, trapped under the heavy blankets of the physical world, but their inner essence, their true, unshielded souls, had drifted upward through the night air to join the sacred gathering. I watched my fellow soldiers walking side by side with the ancient spirits of the mountain, their faces stripped of the hollow, sunken look of exhaustion, terror, and despair that defined our waking hours. Here, under the quiet canopy of the ancient forest, they moved with a gentle, floating grace, their eyes reflecting a profound rediscovery of peace. The air in this timeless sanctuary carried no scent of burning diesel, wet wool, or cheap tobacco. Instead, it was rich with the sweet, clean fragrance of damp earth, blooming mountain wildflowers, and the crisp, clean resin of towering evergreens. Every sound that pierced the stillness was soft and harmonious, devoid of the harsh, mechanical clatter of rifles, boots on gravel, and barking orders that ruled our waking hours. I watched as a young private from my own platoon, a boy no older than 18 who spent his days shaking uncontrollably in the corner of the mess hall, sat knee-deep in the cool, crystal water of a bubbling brook, laughing softly as he splashed his face with water that washed away the permanent, phantom stains of mud and gunpowder. Other soldiers gathered in small, companionable circles around low-burning hearths made of smooth river stones, sharing quiet, wordless bonds of fellowship with ancient monks and travelers from centuries past who had long since surrendered their earthly names to the dust. They were resting, healing, and gathering the fragile pieces of their shattered inner lives before the inevitable return of the dawn dragged them back to the harsh reality of the front lines. Some sat quietly by the edge of a crystal-clear stream that babbled softly over smooth stones, washing away the invisible stains of blood, mud, and gunpowder from their hands. Others stood in silent, companionable circles, sharing wordless understandings with monks and travelers from centuries past who had long since surrendered their earthly names to the dust. They were resting, healing, and gathering the fragile pieces of their shattered inner lives before the inevitable return of the dawn. This profound, restorative stillness offered a stark, beautiful contrast to the endless nightmares that plagued our sleep down in the cramped wooden barracks, reminding every tormented mind that human existence was not solely defined by the cruelty of the battlefield. I lingered near the edge of the clearing, watching the seamless harmony between the living and the departed unfold like a silent, sacred ritual orchestrated by the mountain itself. No words were spoken between them, for language was entirely unnecessary when souls could communicate through pure emotion, shared grief, and mutual understanding. Every man who managed to slip past the heavy iron gates of his own consciousness found a temporary haven here, a place where the crushing burden of survival could be laid down upon the soft moss, if only for a few fleeting hours before the sun rose to shatter the illusion. This was the true purpose of the midnight watch, the hidden sanctuary that existed just beyond the veil of our waking consciousness. It was a nightly refuge where the brutal fractures inflicted by human conflict were gently mended, where the heavy, crushing weight of survival was lifted from tired shoulders, and where every soul, living or dead, was reminded that beneath the uniforms, the rifles, and the hatred of nations, we are all just fragile wanderers seeking the quiet path back home. The deep, infinite serenity that had locked my spirit in its gentle embrace began to fracture at the very edges, trembling as the hidden, unrelenting gears of the universe slowly ground forward toward the inescapable boundary of the night. The luminous, amber twilight of the primeval valley started to recede, dissolving reluctantly back into the harsh, freezing, unforgiving reality of the winter of 1943. The transition was agonizingly slow, a cruel, deliberate unraveling of the sacred peace that had temporarily shielded my mind from the endless horrors of the front line. The rich, sweet scent of damp pine needles and blooming mountain wildflowers began to fade from my senses, replaced instantly by the suffocating, familiar stench of stale gunpowder, unwashed wool, and freezing rust. The gentle, warming glow of the amber twilight retreated like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind the stark, biting shadows of the watchtower walls as they reasserted their physical presence around me. Every muscle in my body began to ache with a sudden, renewed intensity, as if the physical toll of the freezing night had been placed back onto my shoulders all at once. The silent, profound connection that had linked my soul to the vast assembly of wandering spirits snapped with a sharp, invisible resonance, leaving a hollow, echoing void deep within my chest. I watched helplessly as the glowing figures of my sleeping comrades dissolved into shimmering wisps of gray mist, their peaceful faces slowly hardening once more into the masks of exhaustion and trauma they wore while waking. The absolute harmony of the forest shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments, falling away like brittle glass to expose the bleak, unforgiving landscape of the camp waiting just beneath the surface. Down on the winding dirt path leading up the jagged slope of the mountain, breaking violently through the absolute, sacred silence of the alpine fog, came a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. Clack, clack, heavy stomp. Heavy, iron-shod military boots striking the frozen, unyielding earth with a mechanical coldness that seemed to mock the peace we had just shared. The sound of those approaching footsteps grew louder with every passing second, echoing off the steep limestone cliffs and reverberating through the hollow timbers of the tower like the slow, deliberate beating of a war drum. Each heavy impact of leather and steel against the frozen trail felt like a physical blow against my senses, shattering the fragile remnants of the sanctuary and dragging my consciousness kicking and screaming back into the brutal framework of military discipline. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of the relief guards' ragged breathing cutting through the cold alpine air, accompanied by the occasional metallic rattle of a service rifle strap brushing against a heavy winter coat. The illusion of eternity evaporated completely, replaced by the relentless ticking of earthly time and the impending demand for accountability that defined every waking hour of our existence in Camp 41. The cold air inside the guardroom felt suddenly sharper, more hostile, biting viciously at my exposed skin as the protective emotional buffer provided by the mountain spirits completely dissolved into nothingness. It was the unmistakable, dreaded sound of the relief guard stepping out from the lower barracks, making his slow, plodding way up the winding mountain trail to relieve me from my post in the tower before the first morning light broke. With every single physical step the approaching soldier took, the fragile veil separating our two worlds pulled tighter, snapping the delicate, shimmering threads of the spiritual sanctuary. The glowing, serene landscape of the valley began to fold inward like smoke caught in a draft, and the ethereal light of the gathered souls started to dim, retreating step by step back into the gray, freezing fog of the mountain pass. The phosphorescent glow fading from the snowfields was replaced by the cold, dull slate of approaching dawn, and the heavy, mechanical weight of the physical world rushed back into my chest like freezing water filling an empty lung. The peace was ending, and the harsh, brutal machinery of war was waking up to reclaim its domain. The ancient, luminous guardian who had stood steadfast beside me in the absolute, breathless silence of the wooden watchtower throughout the long, harrowing hours of the night turned his head slowly, fixing his calm, glowing, otherworldly gaze upon my face one final, lingering time. In the depths of his timeless eyes, there was no sadness, no fear of the coming dawn, no lingering regret, and no ominous warning of impending doom, only an infinite, profound ocean of absolute peace that seemed to stretch out far across the forgotten boundaries of time and space itself, cradling the universe in its eternal embrace. For countless centuries, he had watched empires rise and crumble to dust, watched battalions march blindly into slaughter, and watched the futile storms of human fury crash against these impassive mountains only to dissolve into nothingness. Yet in this final fraction of a second before the morning light broke, his expression held only a boundless, fatherly compassion for the fragile condition of mortal existence. Without moving a physical muscle or breaking the fragile stillness of the freezing air, he raised his pale, translucent hand, pressing his fingertips lightly and deliberately against the center of my chest, right over where my heart hammered against my ribs in a frantic, earthly rhythm. At that exact, transcendent touch, an overwhelming surge of pure, radiant golden warmth rushed violently through my veins, sweeping away the last lingering remnants of the biting physical cold, the bone-deep fatigue of the endless war, and the heavy, crushing anxiety that had anchored my soul to the misery of the earth for so long. It felt as though an ancient, crushing stone had been instantly lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a brilliant, weightless clarity that filled every hidden corner of my mind and spirit with unblemished light. The heavy armor of cynicism and terror that I had worn around my heart like a second skin simply melted away, leaving behind a pristine, untouched core of pure consciousness. The guardian's voice echoed one last time in the silent corridors of my consciousness, carrying the weight of a timeless blessing that would outlive the mountains themselves. Carry this silence with you through the coming storm, young soldier. The rifle and the uniform can protect your temporary flesh for a single night, but true, unshakable peace is the only shield that protects your soul for eternity. As the final, soothing echo of his mental whisper faded away into the shifting winds of the mountain, his ethereal form began to dissolve. The glowing outline of his body unraveled softly, turning into a fine, sparkling mist of silver light that drifted upward through the open window of the guard tower, blending seamlessly with the pale, swirling currents of the morning fog as it vanished forever into the rising dawn. And as I stood there alone in the quiet cabin, bathed in the soft, lingering amber glow of his departed presence, the heavy burden of the world finally fell away from my shoulders, leaving behind a profound stillness that no war, no cold, and no passing of time could ever touch again. I looked out once more through the frosted glass of the watchtower, watching the first pale rays of sunlight pierce the gray horizon, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that whatever horrors lay ahead on the battlefields below, the sanctuary within my soul could never be conquered. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of iron-shod military boots striking the frozen, winding mountain trail grew louder and more distinct, shattering the fragile, lingering echoes of the spiritual sanctuary that had enveloped the watchtower moments before. Clack, stomp, clack, each mechanical impact against the ice served as a harsh, unyielding reminder of the physical world rushing back to reclaim its domain. The heavy wooden door at the base of the tower creaked open on rusted hinges, followed immediately by the familiar, heavy tread of footsteps ascending the steep, narrow wooden staircase. A moment later, the relief guard pushed his way through the upper hatch, stepping into the cramped, shadowed cabin of the watchtower. He was shivering violently, his breath pluming in thick, dense clouds of white vapor as the freezing air of the dawn rushed in around him. He paused near the doorway, coughing harshly to clear his lungs of the biting frost, and reached up to adjust the heavy leather strap of his service helmet. His face was gray, sunken, and drawn tight with the exhausted, hollow look of a man who had spent too many months breathing the foul air of the barracks and waiting anxiously for a war that only seemed to swallow lives without offering a single answer in return. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, rubbing his gloved hands together in a desperate, futile attempt to generate some small measure of warmth against the relentless cold. With tired, bloodshot eyes, he looked over at me, scanning my posture with a mixture of professional duty and grim curiosity. He noticed the service rifle leaning quietly against the corner of the wooden workbench, completely untouched and uncocked, entirely neglected for the duration of the night shift, a flagrant violation of standard military protocol that would have earned me a court-martial under any ordinary commanding officer. Yet, despite the irregularity, there was something completely different in my posture, something entirely unexpected that stopped the sharp reprimand right at the edge of his tongue. He took a slow, labored breath, his chest heaving under his heavy wool coat, and rasped out through chattering teeth, "How was your shift, Yusef?" The cold down in the barracks was brutal tonight. It felt like the frost was trying to crack the very stones of the foundation. "Did you notice any suspicious movement out there in the fog? Did the enemy scouts try to test the wire again?" I stood completely still for a long, quiet moment, feeling the warm, radiant pulse of the Guardian's blessing still echoing softly within the deep chambers of my heart. I looked past the soldier's shoulder, gazing out through the frosted glass of the watchtower window toward the desolate, gray expanse of the camp below and the silent, snow-covered ridges of the mountains stretching endlessly into the horizon. The barbed wire, the mud, the trenches, and the looming threat of the coming day were all still physically there, waiting in the harsh light of dawn. Yet, as I looked back at the exhausted, freezing man standing before me, a deep, unshakable calm settled over my features. A quiet, reassuring smile touched the corners of my lips, entirely empty of the fear, cynicism, and dread that had weighed me down when I first climbed these wooden stairs hours ago. I looked him straight in the eyes, my voice steady, clear, and completely devoid of anxiety, and answered him with a profound, unyielding truth: "There are no enemies out there, my friend. The camp is quieter and more peaceful than you could ever possibly imagine. The souls of this place are not here to threaten us, they are watching over us, and they are praying for us all." I descended the steep, weathered wooden steps of the watchtower with a slow, deliberate grace, my boots making soft, rhythmic contact with the old timber treads. Every movement felt completely unburdened, stripped of the frantic urgency and heavy dread that had defined every single day I had spent within the barbed wire boundaries of Camp 41 since the moment of my arrival. The sprawling military compound below was slowly waking up to the pale, sterile light of a bleak winter morning. Across the frost-covered parade grounds, shivering soldiers in mud-stained overcoats were already shuffling sluggishly out of the long, dark barracks, their breath pluming in thick clouds of gray vapor as they formed ragged lines for the morning muster. The harsh metallic clatter of mess kits, the muffled shouts of frustrated non-commissioned officers, and the distant, rhythmic rumble of military supply trucks idling in the mud filled the cold mountain air. Yet, as I walked across the frozen courtyard toward my own quarters, I perceived none of this through the old lens of exhaustion and bitter resentment. The concrete blockhouses, the towering watchtowers, and the endless rolls of rusted razor wire no longer looked like symbols of a hopeless, inescapable prison camp. I saw them for what they truly were, temporary, fragile scaffolding erected over an eternal, sacred sanctuary where the ancient earth held memories far deeper and more enduring than any human war. The iron barriers of the camp could hold our bodies captive for a season, but they could never cage the quiet expanse of a spirit that had touched the infinite. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of my barracks, stepping into the dim, crowded, foul-smelling room where rows of iron cots were crammed tight against one another. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed wool, cheap tobacco, and stale sweat, and the men around me were moving with the haunted, hollow stares of the living dead. But the oppressive weight that usually pressed down on my chest the moment I stepped inside the building was completely gone, replaced by a profound, radiant stillness. I walked quietly to my iron cot, set my gear down with a gentle, deliberate motion, and sat down on the edge of the thin mattress. Closing my eyes for a brief moment, I could still feel the faint, lingering warmth of the ancient guardian's touch radiating gently against my ribs, a quiet anchor of unshakable peace in a world tearing itself apart at the seams. I knew that the coming days would bring new patrols, bitter cold, exhausting duties, and the constant, looming shadow of the front lines. But I also knew, with an absolute and unshakable certainty, that the true battle for my soul had already been won in the silent hours of the night. Up there in the high alpine peaks, under the cold gaze of the winter moon, Camp 41 held a secret that no commander, no rifle, and no conflict could ever touch, a timeless, silent grace where tired bodies sleep, where restless spirits find their rest, and where the human soul is finally welcomed home into the arms of eternal peace.